You did not lose your love. Sit with that for a second, because I know it doesn't feel true. It feels like something was taken from you. Like a part of you got extracted somewhere in that relationship and never came back. That's the story your mind tells you when it's trying to make sense of the wreckage. But it's the wrong diagnosis, and a wrong diagnosis keeps you sick. Here's what actually happened. You didn't lose the capacity to love. You lost access to it inside a system that was engineered, consciously or not, to punish you every time you expressed it. Every time you opened up, you were met with silence, deflection, or a subtle correction that told your nervous system, this is dangerous territory, don't go there again. So you stopped going there. Not because the love died, because the environment made loving a liability. This is a critical distinction, and most people never make it. So they spend years grieving the wrong thing. You're not grieving your ability to love. You're grieving the relationship, the specific configuration of a person, a history, a set of hopes you built brick by brick. Those are two entirely different objects of loss, and your mind, in its exhaustion, has fused them into one. It's told you, I can't feel that way anymore, when the more accurate sentence is, I can't feel that way here with this person in this dynamic, because this dynamic was never built to hold it. Think about what actually happens physiologically when you've been in a relationship with someone who operates from a narcissistic pattern. Your body starts adapting to threat. It starts scanning. It starts bracing. That bracing isn't the absence of love, it's the presence of intelligence. Your system got smart. It learned the terrain was unsafe and it adjusted accordingly. What you're calling losing your love is, in clinical terms, closer to protective shutdown. And protective shutdown is reversible. Loss is not. That's why this reframe matters, because one of these you can heal from, and the other, if you believed it, you'd have no path forward at all. I want you to notice something about the way that pain shows up. If you had truly lost the capacity to feel deeply, you wouldn't be sitting here aching. Aching is not the residue of a dead capacity. It's the proof of a living one, straining against restriction. Numb people don't hurt like this. You hurt like this because the love is still fully operational. It's just been standing at a locked door for a very long time, waiting for a room that was never going to let it in. So before we go any further tonight, I need you to release the sentence, I don't know how to love like I used to. That sentence is a lie your exhaustion told you, and exhaustion is not a reliable narrator. What you know how to do is adapt to threat with terrifying precision. That's not damage, that's function, and the same precision that shut the door can, with the right conditions, learn to open it again for someone or something worthy of what you carry. You didn't lose your love, you relocated it for survival. And anything relocated for survival can be brought home once it's safe to come home. That's not a hope, that's a mechanism. And mechanisms can be worked with. Let's get precise about what actually left the building, because he took my love is emotionally satisfying but analytically sloppy. And sloppy analysis keeps you stuck in the wrong story. What was extracted from you was never the love itself. Love isn't a substance that can be siphoned out of a person like fuel from a tank. What was extracted was the supply that love generates. Your attention, your forgiveness, your emotional labor, your endless capacity to explain away, to accommodate, to interpret the worst behavior in its most charitable light. That's what was being harvested, not the love, the output of the love. This distinction changes everything about how you understand what happened to you. A narcissistic dynamic doesn't want your love in the way you want to be loved, mutually, reciprocally, as an exchange between equals. It wants your love as an unmetered resource. It wants access to the byproducts. The validation you supply when you tell them they're not so bad. The attention you supply when you center your focus on their moods. The labor you supply when you manage the relationship's emotional temperature so they never have to. You were never being loved back in kind. You were being mined. And here's the part that's hard to hear but necessary. The reason it worked for as long as it did is because your love is genuinely valuable. Nobody builds an elaborate extraction operation around a low-yield resource. The depth of what was taken from you is, perversely, a measure of how much you had to give. That's not an insult. That's an inventory of your own capacity being read back to you through the evidence of what someone was willing to exploit. Now separate the two columns clearly in your mind. On one side, love given. That's yours. That's what you brought into the relationship, the actual affection, the actual devotion, the actual willingness to build something. That never left you because it was never a possession to begin with. It was an action you kept choosing to take. On the other side, love drained. That's the supply chain, the attention, the forgiveness, the endless emotional overtime. That's what got extracted systematically, meal after meal, until you were running on fumes and calling the fumes love because you'd forgotten what full felt like. This is why so many people walk away from these dynamics feeling emptied rather than heartbroken. Heartbreak implies something whole was lost. Emptiness implies something was consumed. And you were consumed, not because you loved wrong, but because you loved in an environment with no reciprocity built into its architecture. There was no mechanism for what you gave to be met, matched, or returned. It only flowed one direction, and eventually any resource flowing only one direction runs dry. So when you take inventory of what's left of you right now, I want you to ask a sharper question than, what happened to my love? Ask, what was I giving that was never being reciprocated, and am I willing to keep giving it for free? Because the love was never the problem. The absence of an exchange was the problem. And once you can see that clearly, you stop auditing your heart for damage, and you start auditing your relationships for reciprocity. You weren't loved less than you gave. You were simply never paid back. And a debt that was never owed to begin with is one you can finally stop trying to collect from the wrong person and start honoring within yourself instead. Now let's talk about the numbness, because that's the piece people misread the most. You come out of one of these relationships and you notice you've gone quiet inside, flat, guarded, slower to trust, slower to feel, slower to let anyone close enough to matter. And the conclusion you jump to is, something in me broke. But that's a verdict from the heart, and the heart isn't actually the organ rendering this particular judgment. The verdict is coming from somewhere lower, older, and far more literal, your nervous system. And your nervous system is not commenting on your worth. It's reporting on your history. Here's the mechanism. When you spend an extended period inside a dynamic with someone operating from a narcissistic pattern, your body is not a passive bystander to the emotional chaos. It's an active data gathering instrument. It's tracking tone shifts, micro expressions, the seconds before an explosion, the silences that meant withdrawal was coming. Over time, this builds what looks physiologically identical to hypervigilance in a threat environment. Your system stops asking, am I loved right now? And starts asking, am I safe right now? Because safety, not affection, becomes the more urgent, survival-relevant question. That shift is not emotional damage. That's an intelligent organism doing exactly what it's built to do, adapt to the actual conditions it's living in. So when the relationship ends and you notice you can't just switch back to open, trusting, soft, understand what you're looking at. You are looking at a nervous system that is still running the old threat model, because nervous systems don't get updated by a calendar. They get updated by repeated embodied evidence of safety. Time alone doesn't heal this. Time plus safety does. And most people give themselves the first without ever creating the second, then wonder why 18 months later they're still bracing for a blow that isn't coming. This is where I need you to separate two things you've been treating as one: the state of your heart and the state of your defenses. Your heart is not guarded. Your heart is intact. We established that in the last point, it's still fully operational, still capable, still generating warmth the moment it's given a legitimate target. Your defenses are guarded, and defenses are not a character trait. They're a temporary architecture built under specific conditions for a specific threat. Tear down the threat, install new evidence, and the architecture comes down with it. Not instantly, but reliably, the way calloused skin eventually softens once it stops being struck. I want you to think about hypervigilance not as brokenness, but as an unpaid debt of proof. Your body isn't refusing to feel safe out of stubbornness. It's saying, show me repeatedly in small moments that this is different, and I will recalibrate. That's not a wound demanding pity, that's a system demanding data. And you are entirely capable of feeding it that data slowly, deliberately, through people and environments that actually behave the way safety is supposed to behave. So stop reading your guardedness as proof that you're unlovable or used up. Read it as a receipt. It tells you exactly what you survived and exactly what your body is still waiting to unlearn. The heart never needed convincing. It was never the one that doubted you. The body did. And the body can be taught. You are not cold. You are calibrated. And anything calibrated by pain can be recalibrated by evidence the moment you start supplying it. There's a paradox sitting at the center of everything we've covered so far, and I want to name it directly, because until you name it, you'll keep misfiling the evidence. The very thing that made you a target was never a flaw. It was your gift, your depth, your empathy, your capacity to sense what other people feel before they say it out loud. That wasn't the crack in your armor. That was the resource someone else recognized as valuable long before you ever recognized it as vulnerable. Think about how targeting actually works in these dynamics, because it is not random. People operating from a narcissistic pattern are, whether consciously or through pure instinct, extremely efficient readers of who will tolerate the most, forgive the fastest, and stay the longest. That is not a skill they use on just anyone. They use it on people whose emotional bandwidth is wide enough to absorb the impact. In other words, you weren't chosen despite your depth. You were chosen because of it. Your sensitivity was never incidental to what happened to you. It was the very mechanism that made you legible as a source of supply. This is the part that twists people up because it sounds like an indictment of the gift itself. It's not. Listen carefully to the distinction. A resource being exploited is not evidence that the resource is dangerous. It's evidence that it's valuable and that it landed in an environment with no ethical boundary around its use. A fertile field doesn't get robbed because the soil did something wrong. It gets robbed because it's fertile and someone without permission decided to harvest from it. The soil isn't at fault for its own richness. And you are not at fault for the depth of your capacity to feel, to notice, to care. Here's where the philosophical weight comes in. Every one of you sitting with this pain right now has, at some point, quietly considered hardening, deciding that if sensitivity is what got exploited, then the fix is to stop being sensitive. That is the single most common miscalculation people make coming out of these dynamics. They try to solve an exploitation problem by disabling the exact faculty that makes them who they are. That's not healing. That's self-amputation dressed up as self-protection. And it trades one form of loss, what was taken from you, for a worse one, what you take from yourself permanently out of fear it will happen again. The actual correction isn't smaller sensitivity, it's better filtration. Your empathy doesn't need a kill switch, it needs a gate, some capacity to discern who has earned access to the deep water in you and who is simply standing at the shore, hands out, asking for a withdrawal. That gate was never installed in you before, because you didn't grow up needing one, or nobody taught you the terrain required it. It can be installed now, not to shut the gift down, to finally let it serve you the way it was always meant to. So I want you to stop treating your depth as the wound. It never was. It was the target, and there's a permanent difference between the two. A target that was aimed at is not damaged by having been aimed at. It simply needs better defenses around it, not a smaller shape. Your sensitivity is not what broke you. It's what they wanted. And the moment you understand that, you stop trying to shrink yourself out of reach and start learning instead how to guard the very thing worth protecting. Now, I want to take you somewhere most people never go because it's uncomfortable, but it's the single most liberating distinction in this entire process. When you sit with the grief of that relationship ending, ask yourself honestly, who exactly are you grieving? Because I promise you, if you look closely enough, you'll find you're not grieving the person who was actually there. You're grieving the person you believe they were capable of becoming. This is the mechanism that keeps people frozen for years after these relationships end. You're not mourning a memory, you're mourning a projection, the version of them you glimpsed in the early moments, in the rare instances of tenderness, in the potential you extrapolated from a handful of good days and decided represented who they truly were underneath it all. That version felt so real to you because you built it out of genuine evidence. A few real moments of warmth, a few real flashes of insight or vulnerability, and your mind, which is wired to complete patterns, took those fragments and constructed an entire person around them. A person who could have been consistent. A person who could have honored what you gave. A person who, if just enough time and love and patience were applied, would have finally arrived. That person never showed up. And here's the part that requires real intellectual honesty. That person was never fully there to begin with. What you're grieving is the gap between the potential you saw and the reality you lived. And that gap is not a small technicality. It is the entire location of your suffering. Because grieving a real person who is simply gone follows a somewhat predictable arc. But grieving a potential that never fully existed keeps reopening, because there's no closure available from a person who never actually occupied the role you assigned them. I want you to separate these two entities cleanly, because conflating them is what keeps the wound active. There is the actual person, inconsistent, often unavailable, operating from patterns that serve themselves before they serve the relationship. And there is the fantasy, the composite you built from their best 5%, the version you kept extending credit to every time the real 95% let you down. You were never in a relationship with one person. You were in a relationship with two, the one who was actually present and the one you kept hoping would finally take his place. This is not a flaw in you. This is how the human mind processes intermittent reinforcement. A few unpredictable moments of connection are often more powerfully binding than consistent affection, because the brain treats the good moments as proof of a hidden pattern worth chasing. You weren't naive for building that fantasy. You were running exactly the psychological program any of us would run when handed enough fragments of hope to reconstruct a whole person from them. But healing starts the moment you can hold the real inventory. Not who could he have been, but who was he across the actual pattern of his behavior over actual time. Not the best 5%. The full ledger, because once you grieve the fantasy specifically, name it, mourn it, let it go as the construction it always was, you free yourself from waiting for a person who was never going to arrive, because he never existed in the first place. You are not owed closure from the man you imagined. You are only owed clarity about the one who is actually standing in front of you. And clarity, unlike hope, doesn't keep you waiting. I want you to pay close attention to something that happens after these relationships end, because most people misinterpret it completely, and the misinterpretation costs them months, sometimes years, of unnecessary suffering. There will be a moment, maybe with a friend, maybe with a stranger, maybe just alone on a quiet afternoon, where something in you lights up again, a laugh that comes easily, a flicker of genuine excitement, a rush of tenderness towards someone or something that catches you off guard. And almost immediately a second reaction follows the first: guilt, confusion, even panic, as if feeling good is a betrayal of what you went through, as if joy this soon must mean something is wrong with you. Let's correct that interpretation right now, because it's not just wrong, it's backwards. That flicker of feeling is not a malfunction. It is not evidence that you've moved on too fast, or that you didn't take the damage seriously enough, or that your suffering wasn't real. That flicker is data. And what it's telling you in the clearest possible terms is that the capacity was never destroyed. It was dormant. There's a critical difference between a capacity that no longer exists and a capacity that has simply been waiting for conditions safe enough to resurface. What you just felt is proof of the second, not evidence against the first. Think about what it actually takes for joy to break through a nervous system that's been operating in threat mode. It's not nothing. It means for a brief window, your system decided the environment was safe enough to stop scanning and simply feel. That's not a small event. That's your entire protective architecture standing down, even if only for a few seconds, because something in front of you passed an unconscious test that your guardedness has been running since the relationship ended. A dead capacity doesn't do that. A dead capacity doesn't have moments where it forgets to stay dead. Only a living one can surprise you like that. This is why I want you to treat these moments as proof of life rather than as a relapse into vulnerability. When people frame joy after loss as something dangerous, they end up doing something deeply self-defeating. They shut the joy back down the moment they notice it, treating their own capacity for happiness as a threat that needs managing. That's the equivalent of finding a pulse and panicking because you weren't expecting one. The correct response to a pulse is not alarm. It's confirmation that the patient is not in fact gone. I also want you to notice the pattern of when these moments tend to appear. They rarely show up on command. They show up in unguarded seconds, small, low stakes, unplanned, and that's precisely why they're trustworthy. You didn't manufacture that laugh or that rush of warmth or that unexpected tenderness. It arrived on its own, without your permission, which means it wasn't a performance for anyone, including yourself. It was your actual internal state, leaking through the moment your defenses briefly forgot to hold the line. So the next time it happens, and it will happen again more and more if you let it, I don't want you to interrogate it. I don't want you to ask if you're allowed to feel it or whether it's too soon or what it means about the relationship you're grieving. I want you to simply notice it and let it stand as testimony. Testimony that the person you were before all of this is still in there, waiting for enough of these moments to accumulate into a life again. Joy that resurfaces uninvited is not a glitch in your grief. It is your proof of life, arriving quietly ahead of schedule to tell you the worst conclusion you drew about yourself was wrong. I want to address something people say to themselves that sounds like self-awareness but is actually self-punishment in disguise. I don't love the way I used to. I've become guarded, distant, harder to reach, and they say it with a tone of confession like they're admitting to some kind of failure. I want to correct the premise of that sentence entirely because the premise is wrong. You didn't stop loving, you started protecting. And those are not the same behavior wearing different names. They are two entirely different functions, and confusing them is what makes you grieve a capacity you never actually lost. Here's the distinction I need you to hold on to. Love, in its raw form, is generous by default. It gives before it's asked. It assumes good faith. It extends credit without demanding collateral. That version of love is what you brought into the relationship that hurt you. And it's precisely because that version has no filter that it got exploited. So your system did something intelligent in response. It didn't delete the love, it rerouted it. It took the exact same energy that used to flow outward without question and redirected a portion of it inward toward keeping you intact. What looks like loving less from the outside is structurally love doing a different job. Self-preservation instead of unconditional output. This is a critical reframe because self-preservation is not the opposite of love. It is love applied to a new and overdue target, you. For most of that relationship, the entirety of your loving capacity was aimed outward, at someone who treated it as an entitlement rather than a gift. The boundaries you've built since then, the guardedness, the slower trust, that's not love shutting down. That's love finally being allocated somewhere it was never given permission to go before, back to the person who was generating it in the first place. I want you to sit with how significant that reallocation actually is. For years, maybe, you loved everyone around you fluently and loved yourself only in the leftover minutes, if at all. The boundary you've built now isn't a wall keeping love out. It's a redirection keeping love honest, making sure it doesn't leave your hands again without first passing through a system that checks whether the person receiving it has earned the access. That's not coldness, that's competence. That's love that has finally learned to manage its own supply chain instead of hemorrhaging it to the first person who asked. And this is precisely why the guardedness doesn't need to be dismantled entirely, and why healing was never about opening back up in some naive, unfiltered way. The goal was never to return to the version of you that gave without discretion. That version, however well-intentioned, was the version that got hurt. The goal is a third state. Love that is generous again, but now with memory. Love that gives, but checks the terrain first. That's not a smaller love. That's a matured one. So the next time you catch yourself hesitating before opening up to someone new, don't read it as evidence that you're broken or bitter or incapable. Read it as evidence that the part of you responsible for allocating your most valuable resource has finally been put in charge of due diligence. That hesitation is not love's absence. It's love's new discipline. You didn't lose the ability to love freely. You gained the ability to love wisely. and a love that finally protects its own source was never diminished. It was, for the first time, properly defended. Let's arrive at the point everything so far has been building toward, because it's the one that actually requires courage to act on, not just understand. Choosing to love again, a new person, a new pursuit, or simply yourself fully without the old restrictions is not naivety. It is not a failure to learn your lesson. It is the single most decisive act of power available to you. And I want you to understand exactly why, because the reasoning matters more than the sentiment. Think back to what we established earlier. What was taken from you was never your capacity to love. It was the supply your love generated, your attention, your patience, your emotional labor. That was the entire objective of the extraction, which means the ultimate failure of that extraction, the one outcome it was specifically designed to prevent, is you loving fully again, not cautiously performing a version of openness. Actually loving generously, warmly, without a permanent tax on every act of affection. If the goal was to convince you the well was dry, then refilling it and drinking from it in front of the world is not sentimentality. It's a direct refutation of the entire premise you were sold. This is where most recovery narratives get it wrong. They frame reopening the heart as a risk you cautiously take despite what happened to you. I want to reframe it as evidence of what didn't happen to you. Because if the goal of everything you endured was to convince you that your love was dangerous, or that it should be locked away permanently, or that the wisest use of your remaining years is guardedness dressed up as wisdom, then choosing love anyway is not you ignoring the lesson. It's you refusing to let someone else's damage write the final chapter of your own capacity to feel. I want you to notice something about the structure of everything we've walked through tonight. Point by point, we've established that the love was never gone, only rerouted. That what was extracted was supply, not substance. That the guardedness was intelligence, not damage. That your sensitivity was never the flaw, it was the target. That the grief was for a fantasy, not a person. That the joy resurfacing was proof of life. That the protection was love doing a new job, not love disappearing. Every single one of those reframes has been building toward this exact moment. The moment where you get to decide what all of that evidence means for what you do next. And here's the philosophical weight I want to leave you with. Anyone can survive an extraction by shutting the resource down permanently. That takes no courage, that's just scar tissue, hardening over the site of the wound and calling it protection. But choosing to reopen deliberately, with clear eyes and a functioning filter, knowing exactly what can happen and choosing anyway, that requires something the narcissist never had and never will have, the capacity to risk vulnerability without needing to control the outcome. That is not weakness. That is the single trait his entire pattern was built to avoid ever having to develop in himself. So when you choose to love again, understand what you're actually doing. You are not proving you learned nothing. You are proving that what he touched, he never actually owned. You are taking the one thing he spent an entire relationship trying to convince you was permanently his to determine, and you are handing it fully intact back to yourself. You did not lose your love. You relocated it, protected it, matured it, and now you get to choose exactly who is worthy of receiving it next. That choice was never his to make. It was always only yours.